But the upcoming holiday is very complex in Israel because, of course, the attack that happened on October 7th last year was on Shmini Atzeret, which in Israel is Simchat Torah. It's the same day together. Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah is one day in Israel, which I found very hard to understand because we have 2 days and they're very different holidays and they compress them here. And there's a lot of talk in Israel about how do people celebrate Shmini Atzeret, Simchat Torah, when it is on the Jewish calendar, the so-called October 7th. And you can imagine that one theme is we finish Zot HaBracha in a kind of a sadness, commemoration, and we begin Bereshit, that there has to be a new beginning. I'm glad I don't have to give that talk. So I'm going to go somewhere else and see how somebody else gives that talk, because that's a huge task. Okay, and as far as what's happening in Israel, I'll leave a bit of time at the end. Now, as I've been contemplating Sukkot, and I think partly because of a few counseling sessions I've had in my life, and then also recently, not even counseling, just a couple conversations with people that I've met. And as you know, we're having lots of random conversations with people. And I met an Israeli who shared with me that he is taking the philosophic path. He's studying Aristotle and different kinds of things and trying to take the Aristotelian path to happiness. And he says, and I'm still really, really unhappy. He said, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to find happiness. And I shared with him something I've shared with you often. And what I find is a deficiency in Aristotle, because for Aristotle, like with Maimonides, reasoning um, helps you merge with the mind of God. If the highest level of God is God's thinking pure thoughts, when we arise to that level, our thoughts merge with divine thoughts, and we're at the highest level of human experience. This is what Maimonides seems to be saying, and I don't know if that's all he's saying. I have thoughts about that, but that seems to be what Aristotle is saying. In fact, there was a course on happiness that was taught at Yale for a few years, and the person who taught the course basically did a survey of what people thought about happiness. And she mentioned Aristotle, and I think Maimonides a bit. And you know that I studied Aristotle, I still study Aristotle and Maimonides, and I've never found that to be true. So I said to him, and he was a really deep student of Aristotle. I mean, meaning he taught me things I have never heard before. When he was explaining his pathway, I said, "You are saying words I've never heard, so you slow down a little bit. I'm learning so much from your presentation." And then I said to him, would you mind if I respond? He said, "Sure." I said, "I don't. You might get 9/10 of the way with Aristotle. You're not going to jump to the 10th." And he said, "Why is that?" And I said, "Look, I'm rooted in Kabbalah, which is a kind of Neoplatonism and Gnosticism, the veiled, either God veiling God's self into this world, or the light of the soul veiling itself into consciousness. And you don't get there through reason. Reasoning will only take you so far." I said that the depth of God is not reason. Reason is hugely important in balanced lives and lives of insight and understanding. But it can only take you so far. And he says, "Well, what is this other thing?" And we had a talk, and we agreed to meet up again because he wants to. I'm not going to try to push Kabbalah, but I definitely want to push the idea of the veils of divine consciousness, and therefore the veils of human consciousness. So as I thought about that conversation about the so-called chronically unhappy, of course, our beloved, I'll say synagogue member, Leonard Cohen, because even though he's passed, I still feel him very, very strongly present in my life and our community. And I remember a passage that I found from a book called Beautiful Losers. It's the last book he wrote. He wrote it in 64, 65 on the Greek island of Hydra. He published it in 1966. I don't recommend you try to read it unless you want to go into a book that seems intent on breaking literary boundaries. It's a bit of a self-conscious book. He and I chatted about it, and he said, "Yeah, it's there's artistry, but it's not the best thing I've ever done." He says, "Read it if you want to." So the part I want to read with you is actually the most cited passage from Beautiful Losers, and it's about, in general, three people who are studying a saint who's passed away a long time ago, and then they asks, what is a saint? Now, when I read this, you'll see that when Leonard asks in the book, one of the characters in the book defining what a saint is, because these three people are studying a saint, part of what he's doing is trying to define himself, a person who is extraordinarily um, gifted with a charisma that he did not understand. He said, "I don't know why the muse chose me," and he said, "I'm not perfect. I'm not even very good. The muse pushes through me. I'm a very imperfect vessel, and I don't understand why it is I should be a much better person." And as he tried to understand what it meant to bear the gift of poetry and music and his charisma, he wondered about himself until his very end, by the way. Our last conversation that he and I had before he died was very much on this. And it's also a treatment of the human condition. Um, why is it that we are so torn apart inside? And I think among the most deeply spiritual people, the tear in the soul is probably the common theme that we bear. And that's one reason why, I don't especially suggest only the meditative path where we transcend the rupture of the soul into a state of divine merging. I believe we have to intentionally go into the realm of the soul. That was my truah talk, the staccato uh, uh, the staccato beats of the shofar. We have to go into the torn soul to bring the light of healing there. All right, so I'm going to try something I don't think I've done on a Friday night in a long, long time, and that is put a screen share. So forgive me if it doesn't work. All right, can you all see it? Yeah? Any thumbs up?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So this is a passage taken out of Leonard Cohen's book, What is Beautiful Losers? He's asking, what is a saint? Now, again, I believe, and I spoke about it with him, but not extensively, that it is a meditation on himself. And saint is here meant ironically when it's a reflective and a meditation on the human condition, especially spiritually gifted people. A saint is someone who has achieved a remote human possibility. It is impossible to say what that possibility is. So here's a person who knows he has a gift, and there's some fulfilling of the gift, but the person who's given the gift has no idea what that looks like. And part of the torture of the poetic soul, and I'll just say the tortured soul, we don't know what the inner pain is in service of. We know we have it. There's something it says that says we have to transcend it, that we have the potential to transcend it, but we don't actually know what that looks like because we can't know because we're in the the tortured place. Um, so the moments of transcendence, you might say, is that remote human possibility, but we necessarily can't define it. And again, here's where I think Aristotle runs out with the idea of reasoning as we reflect on what I'm going to call being in the grip of the muse or in the trance where the poem comes out or the music comes out. You've been at that remote possibility. You can't define it. I think it has something to do with the energy of love. Now, here's where I can claim private knowledge because Leonard was a university graduate from a very good school, and he had studied Plato, and he had studied the Symposium of Plato, where the idea of eros is discussed. Several people gather at a banquet to discuss eros. As is in Plato's wonderful style, many of the people who speak on eros are like Socrates' victims when he asks them what things mean. The Euthyphro is the most notable example, where people are just befuddled. They use words and they don't know what they mean. And as you're reading the Symposium, one person after another fails prodigiously in defining what eros is. So finally, one of the speakers, not Socrates, by the way, as far as I recall, says eros is rooted in nature, where everything is attracted to everything else, or everything would fall apart. Now, this is part of the of early Greek physics and astronomy, wondering why the moon doesn't run away, wondering why we don't. They knew that the Earth was circular and that the Earth rotated in those days, and why we don't fly off the planet. Um, so Eros is that which both holds things together and keeps things apart. If it holds things together, we would just merge and be back at the beginning where we all merge with the first cause, with that which produced the universe. On the other hand, if we're not somehow attracted, then we spin off into chaos and oblivion. So we all, and how do human beings emotionally experience this divine law? And that is the erotic connections with each other. And under this idea of connection, you can take out the sexual connection, although that's very strong in Eros, but Eros doesn't only mean Eros as in sexually erotic, but also that things that happens where people are just drawn to each other. It's a very mysterious thing. Why, when we meet some people, we feel a very sudden soul connection. Why with some people, why not with others? And what happens when you feel that soul connection? So when he says love, he doesn't just mean he includes sexual erotic love, but he means much more than that, which is what happens, what is happening when we feel a connection. Now, it might be the connection with poetry. Now, I know it sounds very strange, but one thing about poetry is you feel drawn to the poem. And try to imagine in some mystical sense that the poem is drawn to you, that the poet has been drawn to the muse, as it were, writes the poem through the agency of the poet. Let's say the poem exists independently and metaphysically, and the poem is looking for readers. And try to imagine you arrive at the poem, and the poem knows you're there. And the poem wants to be known as much as you want to know the poem. So that'd be something like the eros of the reader and the text. So when you think about eros, try to go way beyond our normal definition of erotic and think of the idea of things being pulled together. Now, by the way, this is anything but the law of attraction. Uh, I should say, because I've spoken sometimes against it and people question me. Clearly, if you're a virtuous person, you have good vibes, you live a certain way, you will attract certain people into your life. But the more base forms of law of attraction is you attract prosperity because you remove negative thoughts. All right, so I'll call that the more base, vulgar version of law of attraction. And I think it's a bad idea because people think that when bad things happen, they've drawn them to themselves. And when good things happen, they think it's their virtue that drew good things. As you know, the good sometimes suffer and the wicked prosper. So I'm going to put that aside. I don't believe it. However, it is clearly true that some of us just have a charisma where people drawn to us. Some of us develop a charisma. Some people are repelled by us and some people are attracted to us. It's just kind of a law of spiritual physics. And the more we become virtuous, the more we become depth, the more we regulate, you might say, we function as a kind of a light and people are naturally attracted to the light. So my long comment here on love is he means eros. Now, with this introduction, you'll see how the rest of the poem makes sense. Now, by the way, this is based on private knowledge with Leonard and not that poets understand their own poems. I have to say very at the beginning, will people say, Leonard, what does this poem mean? He would say, I don't know. I just wrote it. The muse gave it to me. I wrote it. She didn't tell me what it means. So always remember, sometimes the worst person to ask when they produce anything of artistic value is, what does it mean? Because that's the job of a literary critic, not the artist. On the other hand, when he would discuss things, he says, I can tell you what I think it means, but I'm no expert on what things mean. So he was very humble about that. Contact with this energy results in the exercise of a kind of balance in the chaos of existence. So now we're getting at it. In our myths, our myth of Bereshit, remember there's the chaos of existence. God exudes light into the chaos, but the chaos does not go away. So the universe, from this perspective, is a balancing act between the light which is not, of course, visual light, because that doesn't happen till the fourth day, but something called light and the power of entropy. So the power of integration and entropy live at the same time. And that is happening inside of every human being as well. We all have a power of integration. We have a power of chaos. And I think many people, and I include myself in this at many points in my life, the chaos is winning. The integration is losing. And you don't know what's happening to yourself. It's beyond therapy. It's beyond counseling. There's something very deep happening. And therefore, I think the only way to overcome the chaos of existence is to actually go deep inside and work on that chaos, which is something I want to talk about tomorrow morning. A saint does not dissolve the chaos. If he did, the world would have changed long ago. So leads to a thought, we can't solve this. So that's, again, something I point out when people sometimes go into therapy because they want to solve their suffering, and they find, a good therapist who says, you can't solve that. In fact, for many people, that is what drives their genius. The question is how to live in balance with the very painful chaos. So attempts to rid yourself of the chaos and rid yourself of the suffering oftentimes leads to more suffering because you can't rid yourself of it. For many people, it is the source of their genius. James Hillman would say this, that he said, James Hillman, remember, says, one thing that he understands depression to be is the soul calling up to consciousness and saying, come in deep. It's a calling to go deep. And this is James Hillman's deep pathologizing of depression, which clearly means James Hillman suffered from depression. So he says, either something's wrong with me, or my soul is saying, don't pay attention to the world out there. Come deep inside and study the source of your pain. By the way, I read Hillman very fortunately when I was only in my 20s, and that really helped me, that my pain and depression were calls to go within, not symptoms of something wrong with me. You see how beautifully that fits in with Kabbalah. Our breakage is not symptoms of what's wrong with me. When we experience our breakage, it's an indication of our life's work. When you discover your breakage, you discover your life's work. So this is Leonard. He wrote this at 32, by the way, and he had already read Gershom Scholem and many other sources of Kabbalah. You'll see this in his early books. He clearly has familiarity with Kabbalah. In his 20s and 30s, he wrote this book when he was in his early 30s. So we don't dissolve the chaos, because if we dissolve the chaos, then the universe disappears. I do not think that the saint dissolves the chaos even for himself. That's the key phrase here. For there is something arrogant and warlike in the notion of a man setting the universe in order. Now, is arrogant and warlike when we say about ourselves, because in a way, you're at war with your soul, you're at war with your chaos, and you will lose that war inevitably. Don't go to war with your chaos. Now, Rabbi Nachman says there are taksisei milchama, there are skills to deal with your chaos, but you're not going to defeat it. But again, because I have private knowledge with Leonard, one thing that he and I shared, and this is because of his his witnessing of the Soviet Union and Mao. There are many people of his time who believe that the way out of the tragedy of human existence is economic, an externally imposed social order. And he was aware enough to know that both Stalinism and communism in the People's Republic of China resulted in mass murder, more murder than you can possibly imagine. In fact, Hitler's murder of his victims is dwarfed by the Soviet murder of 20 million of its own citizens and Mao's murder of 30 million of his own citizens, because they wanted to create order. And if you're not in order, these brutal regimes will kill you. Now, this is part of the murderous instincts of ideologies They want to bring order into the world. Certainly, what we see with the enemies of Israel, Hamas, the Jew is the disorder of the universe. As I spoke on Yom Kippur, it's a kind of a mystical Gnostic religion to find out what is the great disorder of the universe. The Jew, Israel, is the disorder of the universe. And if you murder all Israelis or murder all Jews, somehow the universe is brought back to its order. Well, that is actually a fundamental characteristic of some Gnostic and totalitarian regimes that have I'll say a Gnostic sense of order, and here I mean something very dark and troubling, which leads to war and arrogance against the disorder. So this is, by the way, sometimes in personal relationships when people discover that their spouse or their child, their partner is in disorder. And it's our job to bring them into order. Well, that's arrogant and warlike. By the way, if you read other parts of Leonard's writing, he knew that was in himself as well. In his relationships, he tried to bring order. And I'll show you one time that he has a passage about a very bitter argument he had with, I think it was Marianne, and he writes about it, just how horrible it is when two people try to repair relationships with imposing order on each other. It's a special kind of hell and misery. Um, so therefore, if we're not going to go at war with other people and at war against the disorder and at war against the chaos with ourselves, so what is it? It's a kind of balance that is the glory. Now, this is something that Rabbi Nachman says in the very narrow bridge. You walk across that plank across the chasm. It's a balancing act. If you don't live the balance between chaos and existence, you fall into the chasm. It's a kind of balance that is his glory. Now, this is a wonderful image you'll see here. Now he grew up in Montreal. Hard winters. I'm sure he wasn't known as a skier, but I'm sure he went or at least saw it. He rides the drifts like an escaped ski. Isn't that a great image? If you've ever seen an escaped ski, like shooting down the mountain, it's riding the drifts. His course is the caress of the hill. So now we're moved from the ski to the hill, which is caressing the ski, guiding the ski down the hill. His track is a drawing of the snow. Now, drawing here either can mean sketched, it can mean attraction, and a draw is also a geographic term. I think this pun only works in English. Is the drawing of the snow in a moment of its particular arrangement with wind and rock. Isn't that great? So what is the snow? The wind blowing the snow, the rock onto which the snow arises, and the constant shifting of the interplay of the wind and the rock, and then the shape of the snow. Now that's a great image for human existence. His track is a drawing of the snow in a moment of its particular arrangement with wind and rock. Now you'll see Leonard. Again, I'm appealing to private knowledge that much of his fascination with Jesus was the person who is sent to suffer, because Leonard knew that his poetry came from his suffering. So he thought maybe my suffering is in service of the muse, and my suffering will help other people be relieved of their suffering. So I have to suffer. This was part of Leonard's fascination with Jesus, which of course is trying to understand himself. Am I sent here to suffer in the service of those who need to read my books and poetry? Something in him so loves the world that he gives himself to the laws of gravity and chance. Okay, so this is the determined law. Gravity, right, that pulls us together, and the chance, the randomness of life. So on one hand, life is ordered with gravity, filled with randomness, far from flying with the angels. And so the fact that you're gifted doesn't mean you fly with the angels. Now look at this image. He traces with the fidelity of a seismographic needle the state of the solid, bloody landscape. So on one hand, the poet is like a seismograph. I'm just tracking the earthquake within me. I'm a seismograph of the bloody, solid landscape of me and everybody else. He's not flying with the angels. He's attached to the solid, bloody landscape and trying to, as it were, draw it. So now this is my interpretation based on talking to a person who says, I have no idea what my writing means. I just write it. When I read it, I was just filled with the experience of a person who was oftentimes called the dark prophet, the poet of depression. But that, as it were, describes as some like the quality of the man as opposed to the genius of the man. And I figured this out as a young person, especially when I read James Hillman. If one of the functions of depression is to call you within, then it is not a pathology, as James Hillman says, but rather when you face the chaos of existence, part of what you're doing is finding your personal experience of, as it were, some law of the universe. And for the particularly spiritually sentient people who experience their feelings most deeply are those who will experience the most suffering. It's not a disorder. There's not something wrong with you, as Rabbi Nachman would say. You just haven't learned the fighting skills to keep that chaos from consuming you entirely. All right, so this is in service of Sukkot being a time of joy and happiness. If you're suffering, if you're chronically unhappy, there's nothing wrong with you. Okay, if you say, well, it's Sukkot, should I be happy? Yeah, that's the mitzvah. That doesn't mean you can do it, but it means you might be able to learn better how to fight it. All right, that's my